Hello everyone, you're very welcome to Journeys. My name is Caroline Brennan. Now, for those of you who are regular listeners, you will know that Journeys is a programme that explores the different life journey of a different guest every week. And that journey can take many forms, whether it is a journey to the four corners of the globe, or whether it's a more personal, spiritual, or an emotional journey. And my guest this week is somebody who has been called the Forrest Gump of family therapy, because whenever there was something important happening in the whole family therapy field, you were guaranteed that she was there. Her name is Lynn Hoffman, and I have great pleasure in saying hi, Lynn. You're very welcome to the programme.
Thanks.
You're welcome, Lynn. Lynn, I don't even know where to start, so maybe the beginning is always a good place. Tell me your beginnings.
My beginnings. Well, I like to think that I was born in on an interesting star, because I was born in Paris. My mother was there because she was this raw girl from California, the daughter of a missionary who fought with her mother all the time. She was very forthright. And she went to New York to study art and design. And she became quite a famous textile designer of her period, which was sort of Art Deco. Right. And she married my father, who was also an art student or a would-be artist. And I was their first daughter. So I used to think that I was born an artist's daughter. And what would that be? What destiny would that be? I always felt it was an interesting destiny. But I never felt what it would be. I was interested in art, theater, literature, and I was good at all those things. But unlike my mother, who was quite driven, she used to say she was not happy unless she felt she had a mission or was on a mission. And I didn't feel I had a mission. I went through college. I went to a good school and graduated top of my class and so forth. And I felt that this all meant nothing. My mother wasn't particularly educated in any scholarly sense, but she was a wonderful designer. And so none of my family came to my graduation from Harvard. This was an important school, and I had a scholarship to it. But somehow I felt that this kind of work, this kind of intellectual labor or teaching, wasn't good enough. In my community, people used to say, those who can do, those who can't teach.
Okay. And you mentioned, nobody from your family turned up for your graduation. Mm-hmm. First of all, what were you graduating with, and how did you feel about the fact that they didn't actually turn up at all?
Well, I graduated with a summa cum laude in English literature. So that was, I thought, very grand.
Oh, I don't even know what it is.
Well, it's the highest possible in Latin. Summa means the highest, the summit.
Okay.
So I was the summit of English literature.
Wow.
And I just accepted that nobody came, because my mother used to say that she was a bear of very little brain, which of course was not true. And my younger sister, she used to call her a bear of very little brain too, I was, those characters from Winnie the Pooh?
Yes, indeed.
So I was always either rabbit because I was smart, or I was owl because I was wise. And not so much wise, but I used long words. So I felt those were derogatory terms.
Oh, dear.
And even though I did well academically, I wasn't proud of that.
Really?
So.
And you speak about your mum a lot, your mother. What about your dad? What was his idea about this very high scholarly daughter of his?
Yes, well, he did eventually read my first book, and he was impressed. He too was interested in communication, but he wanted to be an artist and never succeeded in pursuing that career. I once asked a neighbor who knew my parents when they were young. I said, "What were they like together when they were young?" Because they had degenerated into a very bitter couple by the time I was going to college, and finally separated. And this woman, she was Irish, she said, "Well, your father used to say to me that being married to Ruth, my mother's name, was like being swimming behind an Olympic swimmer and always having water kicked up in your face." Oh, so that that was so graphic. Yeah. And I felt sorry for my father, because my mother he never made a cent, basically. He never went out for a job. And she was always the one who kept the family afloat.
And you talk about a bitterness between them. I mean, how did that, I suppose, that sense of, and failure is definitely the wrong word, but the fact that your father didn't actually achieve maybe what he had wanted to achieve, how did that manifest for him?
Well, I think he was probably quite depressed for most of his life, and living on a very gifted wife who resented him for not contributing. But he was a very handsome man, good bones, as my mother used to say. She used to say that she wanted us to marry Anglo-Saxon bankers. So, of course, I didn't.
You didn't?
No.
And we'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, did your grandparents play any role in your young life growing up there?
Well, I was named after my grandfather, my father's father, who ran a printing company in Mount Vernon, New York. And I was named Lynn because his name was Herbert Lynn Baker, so I was called Lynn Baker. And I had a first name, Grace, but since it was my grandmother's name, my father's mother's name, and my mother also didn't get along with her mother-in-law, so the name Grace was to placate an aunt that my mother liked and this mother-in-law that she didn't. So I never used it.
But you were always Lynn?
I was always Lynn.
Right, right. And did you have any contact with your grandparents, your mother's parents?
They were from California, and since my mother wasn't close to her, her father had died when she went east for school, and he also supported her with a little money that he left to her. And so I never met him or my grandmother because we never had any money to travel, and travel was difficult in those days. Mm-hmm. So I had met my father's mother and father. They had a house at the seashore in Madison, Connecticut, and we would wait till the renters went away in the fall, and then we would have 2 glorious weeks. And my father used to take me fishing, and before we went fishing, we could fish off the rocks in the little village of Madison. We would go at the edges of the waves, which weren't very big because this was Long Island Sound, and we would squash the sand with our toes in order to loosen sand crabs, right, which would suddenly jump out and start swimming, and that was our bait. And I think I loved hunting for sand crabs much more, or beach bugs as I remember we called them, much more than I did the actual fishing, because you can wait for hours and never catch anything.
They're the little see-through things, are they? They're quite sort of invisible in some respects. Because I remember those from even my childhood below in the beaches that we used to go to, and they'd be kind of jumping all over the place. You would often see them on the beach, and of course you thought they were fleas. We used to call them sand fleas, but obviously they weren't sand fleas at all.
I think those were relatives of my beach bugs, because the beach bugs, I never saw them any other place.
Right.
They lived in the humps that the waves created, and they were just about 3 inches underneath the sand, but under the water.
Okay, gosh. And so I'm trying to imagine, as a little girl growing up, and certainly as an adult now, you're reflecting back between, say, your mother and your father's relationship. But as a child, did you pick up on sort of negative vibes or negativity between your parents?
Oh yes, not as a little child. I think it developed more during the Depression, when we were very poor. Actually, my mother did something quite splendid at that time. She came up with an idea for what she called an Index of American Design, which basically was an idea for Franklin Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration to employ artists and to ask them to make renditions, since we had no color photography, of American, you'd call it Americana quilts, weather vanes, chests, Pennsylvania Dutch chests, and things like that. And so this group of renditions was made, and recently they had a show of that in the National Gallery in Washington, of her work, of her program, I should say, getting these treasures in glorious color.
And did that help you through the Depression in terms of getting money into the house?
Because she ran the program for a year or so. But then, this is characteristic, she got angry with my father because this time he lost his heart to a woman who's had a radio program of she sang Spanish folk songs, and my mother was very upset because even though he wasn't being that great a husband, she didn't want him running out after any other women.
Of course.
So she was very angry, and she had gotten my father a job at the WPA, and also his mother, whom she didn't like. But, she herself wrote a letter to the Works Progress Administration saying, "I wish to report that Ruth Reeves is guilty of nepotism. She's employing her relatives,
her own husband and her mother-in-law."
And they were fired, of course. Right. So talk of shooting yourself in the foot.
You'd wonder what the agenda behind that was, really.
Yeah, she was. She was a little, I think, irrational. You would say from that.
Yeah, or angry.
Angry, yes.
Possibly.
That's a better way to put it.
Right.
But and they did separate.
Mm-hmm. What was that like what age were you, Lynn, at that stage?
Well, I always think of the family as like the mystical body of Christ, that there's no way you're going to break it if there are children, and family include children to me. And so divorce is a stage of marriage very often. And I used to say that my parents had a divorce that was made in heaven, even though they never did divorce. I mean, they never did remarry or divorce. But it was as though it was a fixed distance between them, and they never really got back together.
And for the little girl, or even, as you say, your sister as well, I'm wondering, like little kids, they always want their mammies and daddies to come back together.
Oh, yes. Well, I remember going into, they'd call it a depression now, I think, when I was in my teens, when my parents were moving toward a separation. And they called it my moods. I would go into a mood, and then I would be chastised for these moods, which I thought was quite unfair. But that was life in those days.
Indeed. And it was your way of expressing yourself as well. It was your way of expressing yourself and feeling the feelings as well.
And every once in a while I'd have this mad tantrum. I'd suddenly stamp my foot and scream at the ceiling. And surprise everyone, because usually I didn't do that.
What way? How would you be described, Lynn, as growing up? Say, for example, the teenager now. I know you're saying maybe there was a hint of depression, because of the circumstances that you were living through. But how would people looking back now describe Lynn as the teenager and as the child?
Well, my mother outshone her own children. If she met somebody and I was wearing a scarf that the person admired, my mother would rip it off my neck and give it to the person. And she used to introduce us to company as her 3 best designs. So,
sweet God,
I adored her. And I felt, although I preferred her to my mother, to my father, nevertheless, my father was I felt very, very connected to him, so that even though he was not the star in our family, I felt very bad for him in some way. And he was the gentle person in our family. My mother used to fly into rages and go after us with a hairbrush. Well, in the early days she did. Right. But her mother was abusive to her, beat her. Right. So she used to tell these stories as if she were a hero of the battles of family, and
a survivor
and survival. But I think it really my mother was so resilient that she was able to overcome this and become quite a famous innovator in arts and textiles.
So Lynn, when it came then to you graduating and nobody shows up, in some ways for you that was like quite normal. It was expected.
Yes, but I wrecked my own graduation by not turning up for graduation practice, because I had this rebellious side that was saying, well, what's the point? So I went off on a jaunt with one of my many suitors, Harvard boy of some that otherwise I never would have thought of going off with, and missed graduation practice. And this was at the time, it was part of Harvard and very formal school. And the dean, who was a woman, said to me, Lynn Baker, you have a certain je m'en fiche about you, which means I don't care, in French. And so she said that I couldn't come to graduation because I hadn't been there for practice. So I sat up in the back of the hall and watched everybody get their diplomas. And of course, I was the first of them all, but I couldn't get my diploma. So I arranged that pretty well for myself.
Oh, dear.
Now I connect the two events together. Absolutely. If my family wasn't going to treasure my accomplishment, I wasn't going to accomplish it.
Right.
Although I did get my diploma in hand, but well.
Just a question. A lot of the modern movies these days, they all have, when, say, a young lady goes to a prestigious college, particularly in the States, that they belong to one of these kind of houses, kind of like where only girls stay. I mean, was that the case back when you were going there?
Oh, yes. We were allowed to go. We walked over to Harvard and we had classes with the Harvard boys, but we were not allowed to wear slacks, pants on campus at the Harvard Yard, and we were not allowed to go into the Widener reading room. It was extremely sexist, and I used to wonder why nobody on the faculty ever took an interest in me, because all the professors were men. and they had their favorites, their precious students, and I wasn't ever part of that. There was only one professor who I thought really understood me, and he was a kind of minor poet who taught there, who I learned later he had once said of me to someone else, Lynn Baker is like a clear door with fog in front.
Interesting.
Wasn't that interesting?
Interesting. How do you read that now?
I think that I was shrouded.
Yes. Yes.
That I had a clarity that maybe I created a veil or smoke in front of it.
So you had to fight to get to the clarity.
Yes.
You were putting up all these barriers in some respect.
That's true.
Okay.
That's true. And I think partly it was if I got too tall, it would upset my mother. You know, I always felt I'm just an imposter. I'm not really the best student in this class. I just have some tricks of memory that I use.
Oh dear. And
so
of course,
I very much put myself down as a young woman. Yeah. Although I was in some ways the star at school. So
a lot of conflict, a lot of inner conflict, really.
Yes, there was plus I was my mother went through some difficult times when she and my father split up. And I was her second in command. As I went off to college, I was very, very much trying to keep her together.
Okay. A lot of pressure for a teenager, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, gosh.
But
and so you qualified, you got your diploma, and what did you do then?
What everyone did who had gone to college. They put the diploma in a drawer and married a bright and up-and-coming young man.
Oh, how respectable all that was.
Respectable. Well, I was certainly pursued by somebody who was ingenious, energetic, and bright. And we were one of those indestructible couples where they're so teamed together. And in the end of time, that turned out to be not the best situation, because we were both very interdependent. But my husband was very, very bright and energetic, and he got interested in theater, and he got jobs on college campuses doing theater programs. And my job was to be the faculty wife and cook little things for the cast parties, because he was the head of the theater departments in the colleges where he taught. And for 17 years, I was a faculty wife.
Wow.
And somehow I felt that I was failing to live up to my promise in a rather drastic way.
And what promise was that, Lynn? What promise was that?
That I would be like, probably I would be a writer. That was what my dream was. And in fact, everyone who went to college in those days, who went to a liberal arts college, they all had the great American novel in their drawer. But I didn't even imagine a novel, I was just resigned to the fact that I didn't have that kind of talent. So it was I was a star child, but the stars were crossed. It was a star-crossed child.
Yeah. And still and on, Lynn, I mean, I'm a great believer that sometimes we behave in ways and we don't know why we're behaving. So even though you had all the conflict within yourself around, academia and what it actually meant to have the qualification that you got, and your I suppose your rebellion about all that, but still you actually went, and not only did you do it, but you did really well in it. So I suppose the behaviour was saying something that you hadn't even considered in your own consciousness.
Well, that when I look back on my life, I used to say it's like lightning struck a tall tree, and
It's okay.
one part of it fell in one direction, and the other part fell in the other direction, and I somehow had to start over again, and because it was a very strong sensation of, I used to think that I was. I used to have a word for this moment. I can't remember it now. But as though I was waiting to be reborn. Or perhaps there was some terrible... I used to think it's like canoeing down a river. And it's very still and smooth, but you can hear a roaring around the corner ahead.
You know it's there.
And I knew it was there. And we moved to the 5th or 6th college town, and I had my playpen pal, faculty wife number 68.
Oh, exhausting.
Who was my friend, and but I never had a society of my own, and so I was very lonely with 3 young children, and I was also very loyal. So at about the 6th move, we were in California. And as I say, I could hear this roar ahead. And I sort of knew that something was going to happen, that I was going to spring out of the place that I was in. And I even fantasized that I was going to have an affair, which would have been unthinkable, and so when I got a phone call from a faculty wife that I knew, whose husband was a sociologist or something, and she said, I've heard of a person in Palo Alto who wants an editor to help her write a book. Her name is Virginia Satir, and she had an editor, but they quarreled and fell out with each other, and now the manuscript is sort of lying on the floor in pieces. And so I had done some editing at home for books written by psychologists because they can't write.
Okay, psychologist. She doesn't mean to offend any
No,
psychologist
sorry.
listening.
Right.
No, it's wonderful. Go for it, girl.
Go for it, girl. Yes, well, the social sciences do not have starring writers in them.
This is the literalist
Yes.
talking, I understand.
Anyway,
Right.
so I thought, okay, maybe this is my chance. Maybe this is going to be the wheel of fortune that sort of gives me a twist.
And did you think that, Lynn?
Yes, I absolutely did think that. I knew that I was eventing, going towards something. And I got to this old house in Palo Alto, and there were a lot of names on a board down at the bottom of the stairs. And there was Virginia Satir was the name of this woman whom I was told was a family therapist. I never knew what that was. I'd never heard of such a thing. I wasn't interested in social things at all, or politics, but I'd heard that she was a very interesting, innovative woman. And as I went to meet her for the first time, I also noticed the name Jay Haley on as the inhabitant of one of the offices in this rabbit warren. And I thought, maybe he's my Prince Charming. I never met him. And so I went up and met Virginia, and she was absolutely one of the funniest people I've ever met.
Really.
She was big and bouncy and bright, and she wore a lot of jewelry that clanked as she laughed. And she was just a very interesting, original mind. In fact, she more or less horrified the people who worked with her in this, it was called the Mental Research Institute. And the people who were working there, most of them on Army grants, and they were an odd bunch. You know, most of them. There were some psychiatrists like Don Jackson who ran this outfit, but they were the remnants of a research group by an Englishman called Gregory Bateson, who had been very interested in communication, the way schizophrenic so-called spoke, and the way animals communicated. And Virginia was doing family therapy at this place, a pilot program. And very few people had ever worked with families before, and she also videotaped her sessions. So I began to watch some of her sessions. Her book I didn't understand, you know, I sort of struggled with it. But her work was astounding to me.
How so?
Well, if a family would walk in all sad or miserable or fighting, and she would engage with them in such a way that they immediately began to hope. And she had a kind of perfect pitch for the person who was suffering the most. Of course, it would change all the time.
What do you mean by a perfect pitch for each person? What does that mean?
Well, at any one time, there would be, I often think of it as an emotional hot spot, and she would see that a wife was suffering or a child wasn't being listened to, and she would immediately move to respond to that feeling. I think she thought she wasn't a great writer, but she was a great therapist because she followed not so much emotions that she had, but the paths of feeling that would lead her to suspect that somebody needed help, and in what way. Mm-hmm. And she was also very funny. One of my favorite stories is when a minister and his wife came in, and their son had impregnated two of his classmates in high school. Not one, two. Right. And he was sitting when she walked in, and I was behind a one-way screen. The parents were sitting on one side of the room, and the boy was on the other side of the room. And he had on these very tight white jeans, I remember, and he had his head way down because he dishonored his family in a double scoop. And so Virginia walks in and takes in the scene immediately. And she turns to the boy, who of course is not looking at her, and says, "Well, we know one thing, God gave you good seed." So that's a story that I could never forget. Of course, the boy's head shot up, and
pride.
My gosh. And the parents were totally stunned, you know, what is this woman talking about? But then she turned to the mother and said very nicely and brightly, you know, "Well, now tell me what your concerns are."
Right. Obviously.
So,
and you mentioned there that you were actually observing this behind a screen. Tell me about that, because that sounds as though it's like you're watching something. Did the family know you were watching?
Oh, yes, they did know. And also with Virginia's project, it was being taped. Now, this was a breakthrough because nobody ever saw what went on in psychotherapy sessions when you had just one person going in, you know, one therapist, one client. And everything was individual therapy. And so this idea of family therapy, it broke all the laws because you were not, the issue of confidentiality was so important. And nobody had ever seen into this inner sanctum. So this was, for me, I had gone a few times to psychotherapists, and I knew that it was a kind of secret society somehow, You might learn about what went on from friends of yours who had a shrink.
Right.
But I was never too impressed with their stories. But the fact of actually being privileged to see the stories that unfolded when you had somebody like Virginia helping them unravel their situations and laying them out in a way that was more clear than had been, and more hopeful. She was a congenital optimist and would grab good outcomes out of thin air, and other people would be just agog that she would dare to say something like that. Right. And so I just loved her. And then I decided I have to write about her. This is me who couldn't write. And so I would wake up in the middle of the night with a new thought, and I wrote this long, untidy paper called something, Another Look at Virginia Satir, or, people had written about her, she'd written about her work. And my boss, who was running a little publishing house, Don Jackson, he was impressed with the work I had done on Virginia's book, which I helped put together, and then it proceeded to become a bestseller in that field. But I didn't like it because I didn't think she could explain the marvelous things she herself was doing. She simplified it too much. So I was disappointed in the result. And so I wanted to write about her. I was going to show what she really did. So I showed it to Don Jackson, my boss. And he said, why don't you visit Jay Haley, who had a research project in a building down the block, an old half-unused church. And he was the editor of Family Process, which was one of the first journals in our budding field. And so I took it to him, and I had noticed him at the Thursday lunch meetings where somebody would usually present their research. He was a tall, brooding, somewhat untidy man who walked with a limp, and never said very much, but was one of the most innovative, creative people in the group. And I was immediately drawn to him and curious about him. And I had read a book he wrote. It was the first book by anybody in a therapy field that was written in straightforward English.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. I was so impressed. Right. You could understand what he said.
And he was a good writer. Lynn,
he was a good,
you've just
writer.
broken your idea that, they can write sometimes.
Yes. He was the only person.
Right.
And so I was prepared to be impressed. And he must have been in a lonely period of his life. In fact, he told me at one time later that his wife and he had quarreled, so he'd moved out. Apparently, he had attracted a lot of lonely women, and or at any rate, his wife and he'd moved out because of this difficulty. And after he met me, on that occasion, we started talking, and I became fascinated with what he was doing. And so I said, well, what am I going to do with you? And he said, well, I have this project that I was working on with another colleague, but the colleague didn't want to do all the work, and I didn't want to do the work. So I said, I'll do the work. And so I became a co-author of this book of first interviews of family therapists who were the pioneers of the time. And I just fell in love with this man. But it was one of those obsessive situations. It had no reality in it. You know, I can't. It was as though he was some kind of. If I touched him, I get electrocuted. You know, he was just like an archangel in my fevered mind. And now I knew that I had gone around the curve, and now I was in the rapids, and it was roaring all around me. And I went crazy for a while.
Crazy what way?
Crazy. Well, my husband used to tell me that if I started to talk about family therapy, I would get this glazed look, you know, and be unreachable. Basically, I became a missionary and fascinated by it. And leaving California, when I had to leave the work I was doing for this funny little outfit, I just wept the whole way back. And it took me about 7 years to get over this infatuation. And I felt it was not just an infatuation. I felt that it had some kind of mystical authority. And perhaps it was the explosion that I needed in order to take off, like rocket fuel.
And did he know about your feelings?
Well, we never got too personal. So it was like loving someone from afar or being infatuated from afar. But finally, somebody who worked at this place, who had another project, a nice woman, she said, "Lynn, you're always flirting with Jay Haley at those Thursday meetings. Don't you know that he has a wife and three children?
Okay.
So I was shocked, you know. I said, I thought he left his wife. Actually, Don Jackson, the head of the outfit, had told me, I think mischievously, that he was separated from his wife. So I thought he was fair game when I showed my adoration too openly. So this woman put a lid on my display, and I was very careful not to show that I felt anything.
And 7 years is a long time to try and
Yes.
get over somebody.
One of the great, now late family therapists, Carl Whitaker, once said to me, you know, this thing with Jay Haley has gone on too long. And he recognized that it was, but it had the effect of, I had decided that I wanted to be one of them. And since they were archangels, that was pretty remote. But I was determined that someday I would be on a platform with Jay Haley, and I would be on the same level. And so
how right you were, Lynn.
Yes, I was right.
Absolutely.
And I was on a platform at a prestigious conference. And the funny thing was that by this time didn't want to even see him because he was negative territory, you know.
No, I don't know.
Well, at a certain point, he got married. I went to Philadelphia to join a clinic where he was working and as a researcher. And while I was there, he asked me to be in one of his training tapes. He would use somebody as a beginning therapist, you know, and the person he would supervise them and tell them to try this task or this intervention. It was very instrumental. And so I said, oh, of course I'll be in your tape. And then a day or two later, he came up to me and said, you can't be in my tape. I'm sorry, but I've offered it to another woman who was younger than me and blonde hair. And, you know, I was very jealous of her. She was going to be in his training tape. So I said, why? Why can't I be in your tape? And that's when he told me, because you are no longer naive. And apparently he was most at home with beginners. And he even said that about himself. and I was no longer a beginner.
Did you feel threatened?
I don't know.
Oh.
But very often you find that mentors who have a very intense connection with a disciple, that when the disciple gets too equal, too high, that the relationship becomes intolerable.
Gosh.
I don't know why.
Right.
But it changes too much it's some kind of morphic change that the whole shape changes and it can't persist.
Sure. Gosh.
But at any rate, it was my jet fuel.
Right.
It really shot me
Did it?
up and out. And when I finally did write a book, they say that in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So since I didn't consider myself a writer, nevertheless, here I was in a field where everybody who wrote was not very good. So I figured that at least I could do better. And I wrote a book which became, oddly enough, a text. You know, it made me quite a lot of money, and I discovered I could write.
What age were you at that stage that you finally discovered you could write?
50. I discovered the field when I was 40. I had 3 children who were getting along, and it happened very suddenly. You know, it was like predestined. And I think a lot of people who get caught in a difficult relationship, because my dependence on my husband had been much too complete, and he was very vivacious and energetic and outgoing, and I depended on him for sociability, and he was a shaker and a mover, and I was quite passive. But I fretted, and we began, as I became more and more assertive, our relationship became less and less comfortable. And I felt that the children were being hurt by it. And he was also, he used to retire every afternoon when he came back from work and sit and drink till 3 a.m. in his study. And we grew apart in that way. But when we did things together, we would bicker a lot, and he would say things that I felt were demeaning, but he would never apologize. Finally, I decided to break up with him because he would never say he was wrong. That was the way I put it to myself, that I couldn't tolerate this feeling of being put down for every disagreement we had.
How big a decision was that?
Oh, it was momentous. We'd been together for 25 years. We had 3 children, the mystical body of Christ, if you want to use that as a metaphor. And I also, as a child, he'd had polio. So he had a back operation, which left him somewhat as if he had spina bifida, you know, kind of crooked in the back. But he just was courageous, and his sheer energy carried him. And somehow I knew that I had to carry him too, even though he was very aggressive and very apparently independent-minded, and so I offered a divorce that would not leave him in poverty. You know, I split everything even, and I always felt that I think it was my sense about my father that I, you know, couldn't abandon a man who was who had already been struck down. So that was hard, and also then I had to get a job and take care of a house, and one daughter was still at home. So that was the toughest part of my life. But it wasn't as bad as being caught in a marriage where I used to say, "Who among the ranks of the angels will hear my cry?"
Dear.
that's a line from a poet called Rainer Rilke. And it still stands for me, as very often I'll see somebody in therapy, and I feel that she's making that statement with her body, that nobody is hearing her cry. So I heard it. I heard it in myself, and I put it to use in my own work with people.
Right. So you felt it and you acted on it. And as you say, then any experience that we go through in life, we can actually bring to the therapy field. We can bring to the room.
That's true. That's true. And in a way, there have been people who write about the wounded therapist. And I think that that's one comfort, if you can call it a comfort, if people do go through a very rough time, or have or undergo a depression or any of the other really awful emotional situations that people can get in. I think you have to go through it to know what it's all about, because it's a form of hell. And many, many women go through that. And a very uneven marriage is often the source of such a difficulty.
And as women, sometimes we tend to give a lot of our power away to our partner.
Oh, absolutely. I was going to marry a man and treat him as my mother did my father. So you always make up for the past generation and overdo it a little bit.
Yes. Oh, we're talking about family therapy. I mean, for somebody who's saying, I haven't a clue what they're talking about, what's family therapy? What is it? What is family therapy?
What is it?
Yeah.
Well, my 40-odd years in the field have been propelled by that question. I saw gifted people working with families, and they often didn't work the same way, or they had very differing theories. And I would jump into the pool of sharks, so to speak, and learn to swim with them. By sharks, I just mean that there were it felt like a dangerous profession, because you had to not get eaten up and invalidated, and you had to help people get out of the pool of sharks. So it was a highly competitive field too, but it was a field that seemed to attract very brilliant women who, because we had transcripts, we could publish articles based on transcripts, because half of the value of this work was the interaction that made a difference.
So when you're talking about transcripts, you're talking about the dialogue that has happened in the therapy room between the therapist and the family.
Right,
okay.
Right.
And they would have been recorded, so you'd be able to have those.
That's right.
Verbatim, I see, yeah.
So, you put an idea at the beginning and a little comment at the end, and you had an article.
Right, wonderful.
So it was like, instant, if you were a bright woman, you could take advantage of this work that you did. Yeah. And so I've always been inspired by the other women in the field, and some of the women here in Ireland were, among those that inspired me. They had natural gifts that were so amazing, and they took inspiration themselves from ancient Irish legends, that I'd never heard of. And they caught my imagination among, other people who were very gifted, but they had a special place in my heart and still do.
And Lynn, if you decided tomorrow morning that you wanted to go into therapy yourself, would you go to you?
Oh, yes.
Tell me why.
Well, because I know that I would be met with compassion, that I would know that there was a kindred soul, and that no matter my tale of woe, there would be a strong tincture of hope, you know, and that in some way I would get help.
Right.
And the quality of the person, if it was me, would not be somebody who already knew it all or had a given expertise necessarily. I mean, maybe I have an expertise, but that's not what we do. I mean, basically, we kind of grope around together. And then we come up with something which makes sense to us. It's a common cause we have, rather than I'm going to treat somebody, which is is a ridiculous idea when we're talking about failures of hope.
Right. Failures of hope. That's quite profound, actually. Just that line. Yeah. I've read some of your writings. Not very many now, Lynn, to be honest, right? But what has stood out for me about your writings has been the fact that you bring Lynn, the woman, into your writings. Other writers, they will bring in maybe the person and their own professional life, and they'll give you lots of examples. But you have brought your soul, and it's rare, and I loved it.
Really?
Yes.
Even though I talk about the field, it's doesn't keep you out.
No, it doesn't. But it's like, and maybe this is me in terms of why I love storying and I love listening to people.
Yeah.
And if I get a glimpse of the person behind the author's name,
Yeah.
it becomes for me more real. Mm-hmm. And I think for me in the therapy room, I want the real person sitting opposite me and listening to my story.
Well, that's a profound compliment, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Right, you're welcome. Just another question. Family therapy, it's full of, down through the years now, I'm not just talking about currently, it's full of interventions, it's full of narratives, it's full of strategies, it's full of a lot of techniques, right? But what about feelings? My opinion, and I'd like your opinion on this, is that there isn't enough being written about feelings within the whole family therapy arena.
Well, I agree totally with you. Mm. And when I started out, I thought in terms of seeing. I wrote an article called An Art of Lenses because I thought, depending on the perspective that you have, things can look quite different. Mm. So changing someone's perspective was the art. Then I became very impressed by the feminism of represented by people who wanted to hear the voices that were silenced, and often they were voices of women. And I wrote a book called Exchanging Voices because I wanted to listen to people, and I felt that was hearing was then important to me. And more recently, in the last decade, I've been more and more impressed with the work of people who, I think in terms of underground rivers that flow between people and that are not, they're not visible, they're felt. Mm. It's not the same as feelings, but they flow between people, and I was struggling to find the word for that. And I thought it's not empathy because it's between people, and it's dependent on the responsiveness of the other person and your responsiveness. So it doesn't exist inside a person. So I thought of calling the word tempathy, as in traveling empathy. And I thought that's a very different idea from an emotion, although emotions are in this channel very much, and they're felt. And we can see other people being moved by an emotion or by something I say or they think themselves or say. And it's at that level, I believe, that we have to communicate with people or somehow touch them and be touched and show that we're touched.
Absolutely. How do you think, for anybody who's listening in terms of training as a therapist, how should they show that they have been touched, Lynn?
They could weep.
That's okay. Isn't that okay?
Well, I used to do what I called corny therapy, but I'd hide it from my supervisor because, and you'd be surprised how much more open the people who are in this latter day tradition now. They're much more open about sharing their feelings, sharing their life history when it's appropriate, being there, witnessing, crying with people, hugging them, and all those things that they're also part of the popular culture. It's more popular to do those things and accepted. But in therapy, it was against the law. Touch a person and you sink. So I was a rebel in that sense. I said, I don't like this formal way of working where you poke people with sticks, call them interventions. And because I knew I had gone to therapists when I was in my worst suffering moments, and they poked me with sticks.
I can't see you hanging up your laurels for a long time, Lynn Hoffman.
Well, it's irresistible. I find that the people who enter this field, who get sort of you've heard of the rapture. That's our Christian evangelicals that follow this way of thinking. But I think there is something rapturous about a field that's evolving and that has such clear brilliance, people who are brilliant and interesting, innovative. And in 40 years, I'm just as electrified by the sparkles of new thoughts, new ways, I think we're moving